Have you ever wondered how a single act of kindness can change not just one life, but two, or maybe even three? In the quiet corner of a snowbound town, a rugged mechanic closes his garage one bitter winter night, only to stumble upon a young woman sobbing in the shadows, clutching something she refuses to let go of. He has no idea that this chance encounter will set into motion a journey filled with unexpected friendships, silent promises, and a love strong enough to weather any storm. Sometimes the smallest moments hold the greatest miracles, if we have the heart to notice them. Before we dive into this heartwarming story of second chances and newfound hope, if you enjoy inspirational tales that remind us of the good still alive in this world, feel free to subscribe to the channel. It helps us continue sharing stories that touch the heart and maybe, just maybe, change a few along the way. Now let's begin. A poor mechanic noticed a girl crying. Near his garage, what he found under her jacket shocked him. Jake Dawson tugged the garage door shut with a screech that pierced the frozen evening air. The last rays of sunlight barely filtered through the thick gray clouds gathering over the Colorado foothills, and a sharp wind whipped down the nearly empty Main Street, rattling the loose signs and bending the bare tree branches, like old men hunched against the cold. He jammed his hands deeper into the pockets of his worn flannel jacket, his breath puffing into the twilight like little ghosts. Another long day of patching up rusted pickups for farmers who barely scraped by. Another night spent alone in his tiny back room with a can of soup and an old radio for company. Jake was halfway to locking the side gate when he heard it, a sound so faint he almost missed it. A stuttering sob, thin and broken, swept in with the biting wind. He froze, listened. There it was again. His boots crunched across the hard-packed snow as he followed the sound to the side of the building. At first, he didn't see anything but the usual piles of spare parts and a tipped-over garbage can. Then, just beyond the last broken axle shaft, he spotted her, a small figure curled up against the garage's brick wall, barely a shadow in the growing dark. The girl looked no more than a whisper of a person, bundled in a jacket that seemed far too big for her slender frame. Her head was bowed low, long dark hair falling forward to hide her face. Her whole body shook with each ragged, silent sob. Jake hesitated. He wasn't used to getting involved. Life had taught him that stepping into other people's troubles usually ended badly. But something about the sheer helplessness of that small, shivering figure tugged at a part of him he thought had long since frozen over. Slowly he approached, careful not to startle her. "Hey there," he said softly, crouching a few feet away. "You all right?" The girl jerked upright, her wide, terrified eyes catching the last bit of light. She clutched her jacket tighter around her chest as if bracing for a blow. Jake raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "It's okay," he said. "I'm not gonna hurt you. You look like you could use some help." She shook her head fiercely, biting her lower lip to stifle another sob. For a moment, Jake thought she might bolt, but then he noticed something strange. Something under her jacket shifted. He frowned. "Are you hurt?" he asked, taking a slow step closer. Again, she shook her head. But the movement under the jacket was undeniable now. A soft, whimpering sound followed, higher pitched, more fragile than any cry of fear. Jake's breath caught. "Miss," he said gently, "what's under there?" The girl hesitated, tears spilling down her cheeks. Then, as if her strength gave out, she loosened her hold on the jacket. Jake leaned forward instinctively, and what he saw slammed into him like a sledgehammer. Nestled against the girl's thin chest was a newborn baby, barely swaddled in a threadbare blanket. The infant's tiny fists waved feebly in the cold, its face scrunched in silent distress. For a heartbeat, Jake couldn't move. Memories he had buried years ago, memories of another baby, another bitter winter, rushed back with brutal force. He clenched his jaw, forcing the images back where they belonged. The girl's voice, barely above a whisper, cut through his haze. She's only 2 days old," she said, her voice cracking. "I didn't know where else to go." Jake blinked, grounding himself in the present. He couldn't leave them out here. No matter what life had taught him about caution, about self-preservation, he knew one thing in his bones. You don't leave a baby out in the cold. "Come on," he said gruffly, shrugging out of his jacket. "Let's get you both inside. We'll figure something out." The girl hesitated, her arms tightening around the baby, as if afraid this too might be another trap. But when Jake draped his jacket gently over her shoulders, she closed her eyes and nodded. Carefully, Jake guided her toward the garage, shielding them both as best he could from the vicious wind. His hands were numb by the time he managed to wedge open the stubborn door and usher them into the cavernous, grease-scented space. The garage wasn't much, but at least it was dry. The single overhead bulb buzzed to life, casting a pale circle of light over the battered workbench and stacks of tires. Jake grabbed an old army blanket from a crate and spread it out on the cleaner end of the floor. He pointed to it. "Here, sit. Warm up a bit." The girl settled gingerly, still cradling the baby as if her life depended on it. Jake knelt beside them, rubbing his hands together to shake off the cold and the growing sense of panic. "What's your name?" he asked. The girl hesitated, glancing down at the tiny bundle in her arms before answering. "Sophie," she whispered. "And this is Hope." Jake stared at the tiny face peeking out from the blanket. Hope. Something about the name stirred something deep inside him, a stubborn ember buried under years of loneliness and regret, flickered uncertainly to life. Hope. He looked at Sophie, this frightened, fragile young woman clutching her child like a shipwrecked sailor clinging to driftwood. And he knew, without understanding why, that they had found their way to his garage for a reason. Maybe, just maybe, fate had decided it wasn't done with Jake Dawson after all. He stood up, squaring his shoulders against the flood of emotions, threatening to pull him under. "I'll get some heat going," he said, "and find something for you to eat." As he moved around the garage, gathering supplies, Jake stole one more glance at Sophie and Hope, huddled together under the old blanket. The winter wind howled against the garage walls, but inside, for the first time in a long while, Jake felt something warm begin to stir. Something very much like hope. The ancient space heater in the corner coughed to life, rattling and clanking before finally sending out a feeble stream of warmth. Jake adjusted the setting carefully, his movements brisk, but his mind was a whirlwind of questions. Who was this girl? Why was she out in the freezing cold with a newborn? And how the hell was he supposed to help them when he could barely keep his own life patched together? He grabbed an old metal thermos from the workbench and poured what little remained of the day's coffee into a couple of mismatched mugs. It wasn't much, but it was hot, and right now that seemed like the most valuable thing he could offer. When he turned back, he found Sophie sitting cross-legged on the blanket, rocking the baby gently. Her face was pale and drawn, lips tinged with blue, but there was a fierce protectiveness in the way she curled her body around her child, shielding Hope from the cold seeping up from the concrete floor. Jake crossed the room and set the mugs down carefully beside her. "It's not much," he said, "but it'll warm you up." Sophie looked up at him, eyes wide and wary. For a moment, Jake thought she might refuse out of fear, but after a hesitant pause, she reached for the mug with trembling fingers. "Thank you," she whispered. Jake nodded, sinking onto an overturned crate a few feet away. He wrapped his hands around his own mug, letting the steam thaw the stiffness from his fingers. For a while they sat in silence, broken only by the occasional rattle of the heater and the tiny sounds of the baby shifting against her mother's chest. Jake didn't push. He knew better than anyone that sometimes people needed a little time to figure out how much of their story they were willing or able to tell. Instead, he sipped his lukewarm coffee and watched the way Sophie clutched Hope, her entire world condensed into that small, fragile bundle. At last, Sophie spoke, her voice so soft he almost missed it. "I didn't know where else to go," she said, staring into the cup in her hands. "I just kept walking." Jake leaned forward slightly, careful not to crowd her. "Where are you from?" he asked gently. "Denver," she said. "Or I was." A faint, bitter smile ghosted across her lips. "Not anymore." Jake absorbed that without comment. Denver was a couple 100 miles away, a long, brutal journey to make on foot, especially in the dead of winter. "What about your family?" he asked. She shook her head, a sharp, jerky motion. "No family," she said. "Not anymore." Jake didn't press. He knew that particular brand of loneliness all too well. "And the baby's father?" Sophie flinched, and Jake immediately regretted the question. But after a long pause, she answered, her voice hollow. He didn't want her, she said simply. His family said she was a mistake, that I was a mistake. Jake's jaw tightened. He'd seen enough selfishness and cruelty in his life to recognize it when he heard it. Still, hearing it from the mouth of a girl who couldn't be more than 22 hit harder than he expected. He shifted on the crate, trying to shake off the tightness growing in his chest. Well, he said, forcing a note of gruff kindness into his voice, they were wrong. Sophie blinked at him, clearly startled. You hear me? Jake said, holding her gaze. That little girl there, she's no mistake, and neither are you. For a long moment, Sophie just stared at him. Then her lower lip quivered, and she bit it hard to stop the tears threatening to spill over. Jake looked away, giving her the dignity of privacy. Instead, he focused on Hope, whose tiny face had relaxed into peaceful sleep against her mother's chest. She's beautiful, he said quietly. Sophie gave a small, shaky laugh, a sound so fragile it seemed it might shatter at the slightest breeze. She is, she whispered. She's everything. Jake nodded, understanding more than he cared to admit. The heater sputtered again, casting flickering shadows across the grease-streaked walls. Outside, the wind howled harder, rattling the loose paneling. Inside, the little pocket of warmth they'd carved out felt fragile, tentative, as if at any moment it might dissolve back into the cold and dark. Jake rubbed a hand over his face, feeling the rough scrape of days-old stubble. You can stay here tonight, he said finally, breaking the silence. It's not much, but it's better than out there. Sophie hesitated, glancing around the cluttered garage with a look that mingled gratitude and embarrassment. I don't have any money, she said quickly, as if fearing he might change his mind. Jake waved the words away. Not asking for any, he said. I figure you're paying me just by being here. Place could use a little more life in it anyway. Sophie smiled. A real smile this time. Faint but genuine. And Jake felt something loosen inside him. Something he hadn't even realized had been knotted tight for years. He stood up, stretching the stiffness from his limbs. I'll grab a few more blankets from the back, he said. You just rest. You're safe here. As he disappeared into the shadows of the storage room, Jake let out a slow, steadying breath. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. Hell, he barely knew how he was going to make it through the week with 2 extra mouths to worry about. But for tonight at least, he could offer them this. A little warmth, a little safety, and maybe, just maybe, the faint beginnings of hope. The morning broke pale and brittle, like a sheet of thin ice. Sunlight trickled through the dusty windows of the garage, barely warming the cluttered space. Jake stirred on his makeshift cot near the workbench, the ache in his back a sharp reminder that he was no longer a young man. He sat up slowly, scrubbing his hands over his face, before glancing toward the far side of the garage. Sophie was curled up on the old army blanket, the baby tucked safely against her chest. Hope's tiny fist had wormed its way free of the swaddle during the night, and now rested against her mother's heart. Jake smiled softly. For a moment, the battered garage didn't feel so cold or empty. The heater had given up sometime in the night, leaving the air sharp and unforgiving. Jake pulled his jacket tighter around his shoulders and moved quietly, not wanting to wake them. But as he rummaged through a crate looking for the emergency camping stove he kept for power outages, he heard a soft, stifled sound, almost like a hiccup. Turning, he saw Sophie awake, blinking against the harsh light. Her lips were pale, and there were deep shadows under her eyes. Jake knelt beside her, keeping his voice low. You okay? Sophie nodded weakly, but it was clear she was hanging by a thread. Her arms tightened protectively around Hope. Jake made a quick decision. Let's get you both something warm, he said. Stay put. From a battered locker near the back, Jake dug out an old canister of powdered baby formula and a battered baby bottle, remnants from a life he rarely let himself think about. He didn't question why he still had them. Maybe a part of him had always hoped for something. He filled the bottle with water from a jug and set it carefully on the camp stove to heat. As he worked, he could feel Sophie's eyes on him, wary, uncertain, but tinged with a fragile kind of hope. When the water was warm but not scalding, Jake mixed the formula carefully, shaking the bottle until it was smooth. He knelt beside Sophie again, offering the bottle. You want me to? He asked. Sophie hesitated, then shifted Hope slightly and accepted the bottle with trembling hands. The baby latched almost immediately, sucking greedily. Tears sprang to Sophie's eyes. She wiped them away roughly with the sleeve of her jacket. "She hasn't eaten properly since yesterday," she whispered, her voice cracking. Jake swallowed the tight knot in his throat. "You're doing good," he said quietly. "You're doing real good." Sophie shook her head, the raw honesty of exhaustion stripping away whatever walls she'd managed to put up. "I don't know what I'm doing," she admitted, her voice breaking. "I don't even know if I can keep her safe." Jake leaned back on his heels, studying her. "You kept her alive through the coldest night of the year," he said. "You're stronger than you think." Sophie stared at him for a long moment, as if weighing his words. Then almost reluctantly, she gave a tiny nod. The baby finished her bottle, sighing contentedly. Sophie shifted Hope carefully against her shoulder, patting her back in slow, nervous rhythms. Jake watched, feeling an ache deep in his chest, a complicated tangle of memory, regret, and something startlingly close to hope. "You said her name's Hope," he said, his voice soft. Sophie nodded. "I named her that because that's what I needed the most," she said, her voice barely more than a breath. Jake felt something inside him shift. He glanced around at the grease-streaked walls, the cluttered benches, the forgotten corners of his life. Maybe, he thought, they both needed the same thing. "Hope's a good name," he said gruffly. "Fits her." Sophie smiled, a real one this time, shy but genuine. It lit up her face in a way that made Jake's breath catch. "Thank you," she said. They sat in companionable silence for a while, broken only by the small sounds of Hope snuffling in her sleep. Jake leaned back against a stack of tires, feeling the weight of the night settle into his bones. He had no idea what he was doing. He didn't have the money to take care of a baby, let alone a young woman and her child. His garage barely kept him afloat as it was. But somehow, looking at Sophie and Hope, he knew he couldn't turn them away. Not now, not ever. They needed him. And maybe, just maybe, he needed them too. He cleared his throat, suddenly feeling awkward. "Look," he said, "it's not much, but you can stay here, as long as you need." Sophie blinked, clearly stunned. "You mean it?" Jake nodded. "Yeah, I mean it. It's not the Ritz, but it's warm. Mostly. And I could use some help around the shop if you're up for it." Sophie laughed, a soft, incredulous sound, and nodded. "I can try," she said. Jake grinned. "Trying's all any of us can do." Hope let out a tiny squeak, stretching her arms above her head in a gesture so adorably human it made Jake chuckle. He reached out hesitantly, then stopped himself, unsure if it was his place. Sophie noticed. She shifted Hope gently toward him, offering her without words. Jake's large, calloused hand brushed against the baby's tiny fist. Hope's fingers curled instinctively around one of his. Jake froze, the contact sending a jolt straight through him. Sophie smiled through her tears. "I think she likes you," she said. Jake swallowed hard, blinking against the sudden sting behind his eyes. "Yeah," he whispered. "I think I like her too." Outside, the morning light grew stronger, slowly chasing away the night. Inside the garage, something fragile but fierce took root. A beginning. A family still rough around the edges, still uncertain, but real. And sometimes, Jake thought, real was more than enough. The days slipped into a tentative rhythm. Morning brought the creak of the garage door lifting, the buzz of the heater fighting against the winter chill, and the rich, bitter smell of Jake's coffee brewing on the battered hot plate. Sophie, true to her word, pitched in without complaint. She swept the floor, organized the cluttered tool shelves, and even managed to figure out the ancient cash register Jake had all but given up on. Hope, swaddled and drowsy in a hand-me-down baby sling, Jake found buried in a box of old clothes, spent most of her days nestled against Sophie's chest, a tiny bundle of quiet life in the heart of the grease-streaked garage. Jake wasn't sure when exactly it started happening, but soon customers began lingering longer than necessary after their oil changes or tire rotations. They'd smile a little wider when Sophie rang them up, or chuckle when Hope gurgled happily from her perch behind the counter. And slowly, tentatively, a trickle of warmth returned to Jake's world, the kind of easy, neighborly affection he hadn't felt in years. One morning, as Jake tightened the lug nuts on a battered Ford truck, he heard the jangle of the front bell. Wiping his hands on a rag, he glanced up to see a familiar figure striding into the garage. It was Edna Clark, a retired schoolteacher who ran the thrift store down the street. Short, feisty, and sharp as a tack at nearly 70, Edna was a fixture in the town, and not someone you wanted to cross. "Morning, Jake," she called briskly, her sharp eyes already scanning the room. "Heard a rumor you've got some new help." Jake chuckled, tossing the rag aside. "Word travels fast around here." Edna's gaze settled on Sophie, who was gently rocking Hope while sorting a box of spark plugs. Her expression softened. "Well, aren't you just a sight?" Edna said warmly. She crossed the room without hesitation and peered down at Hope, who blinked up at her with solemn, wide eyes. Jake watched, tension coiled in his gut. He wasn't sure how much he wanted Sophie exposed to the gossipy undercurrents of small-town life, but to his surprise, Edna didn't pepper her with nosy questions or judgmental looks. Instead, she cooed at Hope and pulled a knitted baby hat from her oversized handbag. "Made this myself," she said, plopping it gently on Hope's tiny head. "Figured she might need something warmer than that thin blanket." Sophie's mouth opened in shock. For a moment, she looked ready to cry again. Thank you," she managed, her voice thick. Edna patted Sophie's arm briskly. "Don't mention it, honey. Babies belong to all of us, you hear? You need anything at all. You come see me." Sophie nodded, blinking rapidly. Jake swallowed past the sudden tightness in his throat. As Edna bustled back out into the cold, she threw a wink over her shoulder. "You did good, Jake Dawson," she said. "Real good." Jake didn't know what to say to that, so he just tipped his cap and watched her go. Later that afternoon, while Jake was elbow-deep under the hood of an ancient Chevrolet, another visitor arrived. This time it was Tom Green, a heavy-set farmer whose family had worked the nearby fields for generations. Tom was a man of few words, but he had a heart the size of the county. He set a cardboard box on the workbench with a grunt. "Figured you could use these," he said. Inside the box were cans of soup, jars of applesauce, boxes of crackers, and a packet of diapers. Jake stared at it, stunned. Tom just shrugged. "Hard winter coming," he said. "No shame in needing a hand." Before Jake could find words, Tom clapped him on the shoulder with enough force to nearly knock him over and lumbered back out into the fading afternoon light. Jake stood there for a moment, blinking down at the box. Sophie appeared at his side, Hope cradled in one arm. "You know all these people?" she asked, wonder in her voice. Jake nodded slowly. "Yeah, I guess I do." Sophie looked at him, something soft and amaze flickering across her face. "I've never seen anything like this," she said. "People just giving. No strings." Jake rubbed the back of his neck, a little embarrassed. "Small towns," he said. "We look out for each other. Most of the time." He didn't add that he hadn't felt part of that "we" for a long time. Not until now. Sophie smiled, and the smile transformed her. It chased the fear from her face, filled her eyes with a light Jake hadn't seen before. For the first time in what felt like forever, he let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a place for all three of them here. That evening, after the garage door rattled shut and the heater whirred to life again, Jake brewed a fresh pot of coffee and shared a can of stew with Sophie. Hope dozed in a borrowed bassinet Jake had cleaned up, a tiny anchor of peace in the center of their ramshackle little world. Jake leaned back in his chair, sipping from his mug, watching the flames flicker in the tiny camping stove. "You know," he said, breaking the companionable silence, "when I was a kid, I used to think fixing things would fix everything. Cars, tractors, engines, you name it." Sophie tilted her head, curious. "And did it?" she asked. Jake chuckled softly. "Not even close," he said. "Turns out some things you gotta fix from the inside out." Sophie nodded, her gaze drifting toward Hope, who stirred and let out a soft sigh. "Maybe that's what we're doing," she said thoughtfully. "Fixing ourselves. A little at a time." Jake smiled at her across the table. The warmth between them no longer tentative but growing stronger, steadier. "Maybe we are," he agreed. Outside, the wind howled against the walls. But inside Hope's garage, there was laughter, and light, and something new blooming. Something neither of them dared name just yet. Something that felt an awful lot like family. The cold that had gripped the town seemed to settle deeper as January wore on. The days stayed short, the nights longer still, and even inside the garage, warmth was something they had to build moment by moment, through laughter, hard work, and the steady small kindnesses that stitched them closer together. Jake was starting to believe that maybe life was finally turning a corner, until the black sedan pulled up in front of Hope's garage. He spotted it through the smeared window as he adjusted a carburetor on a battered Dodge. It was out of place immediately. Too clean, too polished, too predatory. The engine purred low, almost disdainfully, before shutting off with a soft cough. Jake set his wrench down slowly, every instinct in his body prickling. The driver's door opened, and a tall man in an expensive overcoat stepped out. His hair was neatly combed, his shoes polished to a mirror shine. A gold ring gleamed on his finger, catching the thin winter light. Jake didn't recognize him, but he knew the type. Money, power, entitlement, and trouble. Sophie, behind the counter, had seen it too. She stiffened, her hand instinctively cradling Hope, who slept unaware in her bassinet. The man walked in without bothering to knock, the smell of cold air and expensive cologne trailing after him. His eyes swept the garage once, dismissive, before locking onto Sophie. "There you are," he said, voice sharp and clipped. Sophie went pale. She clutched the counter as if it might keep her standing. Jake stepped forward, placing himself subtly between them. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice low and steady. The man barely spared him a glance. "I'm not here for you," he said curtly. "I'm here for her." Jake didn't move. Sophie's voice, when it came, was barely more than a whisper. "Mr. Langston." Jake felt the weight of the name settle like a stone in his gut. Langston. The Langston family owned half of Denver's real estate and had their hands in everything from banking to politics. Jake didn't know much about them, but he knew enough. They didn't lose, they didn't forget, and they didn't forgive. Mr. Langston smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "My son may have made mistakes," he said, voice dripping with false civility, "but we don't intend for those mistakes to tarnish our family's reputation further." Jake's hands curled into fists at his sides. Hope stirred in her bassinet, letting out a soft, uncertain whimper. Langston's gaze flicked briefly toward the sound, then back to Sophie. "You will come with me," he said crisply. "We have arranged suitable accommodations for you. Medical care, a monthly stipend. In exchange, you will surrender full custody of the child." Sophie swayed where she stood. Jake took a half step closer, ready to catch her if she fell. She shook her head slowly, disbelief written in every trembling line of her body. "You want me to give her up?" she said, her voice raw. Langston's smile widened, condescending. "You'll be well compensated," he said. "More than fairly." Jake couldn't stay silent any longer. "She's not a business deal," he said, his voice cold. "She's a human being." Langston turned his gaze fully on Jake now, assessing, calculating. "And you are?" he asked, voice dripping with contempt. Jake lifted his chin. "Someone who gives a damn," he said simply. For a heartbeat, the air between them crackled, heavy with unspoken threats. Then Langston straightened his coat with a snap. "You have until the end of the week," he said to Sophie. "Make the right decision." He tossed a thick envelope onto the counter with a sharp flick of his wrist. And then he turned and walked out, the door banging shut behind him, leaving the faint smell of cold steel and arrogance in his wake. The silence in the garage was deafening. Sophie stared at the envelope as if it might catch fire. Her hands trembled visibly. Jake crossed the room and gently slid the envelope into a drawer. "Forget it," he said. "We're not for sale." Sophie's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know what to do," she whispered. "I don't want to lose her. But they're powerful. They can take her." Jake reached out, hesitated, and then placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "They can try," he said quietly. "But they're not going to do it without a fight." Sophie looked up at him, searching his face for something. Strength, maybe, or certainty. Whatever she saw there, it made her straighten slightly, squaring her shoulders. "I won't give her up," she said, voice still trembling but stronger now. "No matter what." Jake nodded. "Good," he said. "We'll figure it out." Hope let out another soft sound, and Sophie scooped her up instinctively, cradling the baby close. She pressed her lips to Hope's forehead, whispering words Jake couldn't hear. But he didn't need to. He could see the promise in Sophie's eyes, and he silently made one of his own. Whatever storms were coming, and Jake had no illusions they would be easy. They would face them together. He would stand between Sophie, Hope, and whatever darkness tried to rip them apart. Because some things in life were worth fighting for. Some things were worth everything. And for the first time in years, Jake Dawson knew exactly what he was willing to fight for. The envelope sat in the drawer like a loaded gun. Jake could feel its presence every time he passed the counter. A silent, heavy thing that seemed to taint the very air around it. Sophie avoided even looking in its direction. She kept busy, scrubbing the already clean counter, reorganizing toolboxes, checking and rechecking the shelves in the small parts closet. Anything to keep her hands occupied, her mind distracted. Jake didn't press her. He understood better than anyone that decisions made under fear had a way of haunting a person for a lifetime. Instead, he spent the next 2 days doing what he did best, keeping his hands busy and his mouth shut unless something important needed saying. Hope, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around her, babbled and cooed from her makeshift crib by the space heater. Her tiny presence filled the cavernous garage with a kind of stubborn, radiant warmth that neither winter's chill nor Langston's threats could quite erase. Still, Jake caught the way Sophie would pause sometimes, one hand resting protectively over her daughter, staring into a middle distance only she could see. He knew what she was thinking. The temptation was real. A guaranteed roof over her head, medical care for Hope, a future that didn't involve scraping by in a freezing garage and depending on the charity of strangers. It would be so easy to convince herself she was doing it for the baby, that she could endure a broken heart if it meant Hope would never know hunger or cold. Jake had seen good people make bad choices for far less noble reasons, and that scared him more than Langston's threats ever could. On the third evening after Langston's visit, Jake found Sophie outside, sitting on the back step of the garage. The sky overhead was a bruised purple, fading into a blanket of cold stars. She held the envelope in her lap, unopened. Her fingers traced its edge as if it might bite. Jake approached slowly, boots crunching over the brittle patches of snow. "Mind some company?" he asked. Sophie shook her head without looking up. Jake settled beside her, the cold seeping quickly through his jeans. He ignored it. For a while they sat in silence, listening to the soft sigh of the wind curling through the trees at the edge of town. Finally, Sophie spoke. "My mom used to tell me," she said, voice small, "that sometimes the hardest thing to do is the right thing, because it doesn't feel good right away. It feels awful, lonely, scary." Jake nodded, staring out at the dark. "Smart woman," he said. Sophie laughed weakly. "She wasn't wrong," she said. "I keep thinking, what if I'm being selfish? What if taking their offer would be better for Hope? Safer?" Jake shifted to face her, choosing his words carefully. "You're thinking like a mother," he said, "and that's never selfish." Sophie finally looked at him, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "But what if I can't give her what she needs?" she whispered. "What if love isn't enough?" Jake felt something deep inside him clench. He wanted to tell her that love was enough, that it conquered everything. But life had taught him that sometimes love alone wasn't enough. Sometimes you needed grit and stubbornness and a community willing to stand with you when the world turned its back. He reached over and gently closed her hand around the envelope. "You're not alone," he said quietly. "Not anymore." Sophie stared at him for a long moment. Then slowly, deliberately, she stood up, walked to the garbage can by the garage wall, and dropped the envelope inside without a second glance. Jake watched as she wiped her hands on her jeans like she was scrubbing away the last traces of doubt. She turned back to him, shoulders squared, chin lifted. "I choose her," she said simply. "Every time." Jake felt something swell in his chest. Pride, relief, something close to awe. He rose to his feet and offered his hand. Without hesitation, Sophie placed her smaller hand in his, and he gave it a reassuring squeeze. "You're stronger than you think," he said. Sophie smiled, a real, brilliant smile that seemed to chase the night's chill away. "So are you," she said. Together they went back inside where hope stirred in her sleep, the faintest hint of a smile curving her tiny lips. Later that night, as Jake sat by the camp stove, nursing a mug of coffee, he allowed himself to hope. Really hope. Not the cautious, half-hearted hope he'd clung to for years, but something fuller, richer, built not on dreams, but on choices made when they mattered most. He watched Sophie as she settled hope into her crib, murmuring a lullaby so soft it barely brushed the air. Jake leaned back, letting the warmth of the moment soak into his bones. Somewhere out there, Langston was probably already planning his next move. Jake wasn't naive enough to think they'd seen the last of him, but tonight, the world outside could wait. Tonight, they had each other, and that was enough. For now, that was everything. The storm rolled in without warning. One moment, the sky above the small town was clear but pale. The next, thick, steel-gray clouds barreled over the mountains like an unstoppable army. The wind picked up, shrieking down the narrow streets, carrying the promise of snow and something worse. Bitter, bone-deep cold. Jake was outside, securing the garage's loose gutters with a length of rope when the first flakes fell, large, wet, and heavy. He glanced at the horizon, heart sinking at the sight. Looks bad. Tom Green had warned him earlier at the gas station. Could lose power, maybe even get snowed in. Jake hadn't thought much of it at the time. In Colorado, a storm was just another part of winter. But now, feeling the temperature drop by the minute, he moved faster. Inside, Sophie tucked Hope into the old bassinet layered with every spare blanket they could find. She was humming under her breath, something soft and almost desperate, as if she could will the cold away through sheer force of will. By nightfall, the garage felt like an island cut off from the world. Snow piled against the doors and windows, and even the ancient heater seemed to struggle against the deepening cold. Jake stoked the camp stove higher, boiling water for instant oatmeal and rationing the coffee. They layered clothes, made a nest of blankets around the baby, and huddled close. They would be fine, Jake told himself. They'd faced worse. But sometime after midnight, Hope started coughing. At first it was just a small, congested sound. Harsh, wet. Sophie leaned over, patting her daughter's back, whispering soft words of comfort. But within an hour, the cough deepened. It rattled through the tiny body like a drumbeat of warning. Hope's cheeks flushed, her forehead burned under Sophie's trembling fingers, and when Jake touched her tiny hand, he felt the unmistakable heat of fever. Panic clawed at the edges of his mind. "Jake," Sophie said, voice shaking. "She's burning up." Jake grabbed the small first aid kit he kept on a shelf, rummaging through it with shaking hands. No fever medicine, no pediatric supplies, just gauze, bandages, and a few antiseptic wipes. He cursed under his breath, a rare slip, and paced the floor, trying to think. The hospital was 5 miles away, an eternity in this storm. His old truck might make it, but maybe not in time. And even if it did, what if the roads were closed or the power was out at the clinic? Hope whimpered, a soft, heart-wrenching sound. Sophie rocked her back and forth, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. "I should have taken the offer," she whispered brokenly. "I should have—" "No," Jake said fiercely, crouching in front of her. "Don't you dare think like that. We're going to help her. You hear me? We're going to fight for her." Sophie looked at him, eyes wide and terrified, clinging to his words like a lifeline. Jake made a decision, not the safest choice, not even the smartest, but it was the only one he could live with. He snatched his keys off the hook, grabbed a heavy coat, and turned to Sophie. "I'm taking her to the hospital," he said. "Bundle her up, as warm as you can." Sophie didn't argue. She wrapped Hope in layers of blankets and sweaters until the baby was a soft, trembling bundle of warmth and fear. Jake scooped Hope into his arms. She felt impossibly light, too light. Sophie grabbed her own jacket and followed, not saying a word, just breathing in shaky bursts as they forced the door open against the wall of snow. The world outside was blinding, whiteness swirling and battering them from every side. The wind howled like a living thing, cruel and merciless. Jake shielded Hope with his body as he fought his way to the truck, Sophie stumbling beside him. It took 3 tries to get the engine to catch. When it finally roared to life, Jake didn't waste a second. He threw the truck into gear and gunned it down the barely visible road, the tires sliding treacherously under them. The town was a ghost, every familiar landmark buried under drifts. Visibility was no more than a few feet ahead, headlights swallowed by the storm. Jake kept his hands clenched tight on the wheel, knuckles white. His heart hammered in his chest, but he kept his voice calm for Sophie's sake. "Talk to her," he said over the roar of the wind. "Keep her awake." Sophie leaned forward, murmuring nonsense words, singing broken scraps of lullabies, anything to keep hope tethered to them. Minutes stretched into an eternity. At last, the faint glow of the hospital's emergency entrance broke through the storm, a beacon in the endless white. Jake skidded the truck into the lot, throwing it into park before the vehicle had even stopped moving. He leapt out, hope cradled to his chest, Sophie right behind him. They burst through the emergency doors, a flurry of snow and desperation. Nurses descended on them immediately, taking Hope from Jake's arms, whisking her away behind swinging double doors. And suddenly Jake and Sophie were left standing alone in the too bright, too sterile waiting room, their hands empty, their hearts full of terror. Sophie clutched Jake's jacket with both hands. "What if it's too late?" she whispered. Jake pulled her close without thinking, wrapping her trembling body in his arms. "It's not," he said fiercely. "It's not too late. She's a fighter, just like her mama." They stood there frozen in that moment, two souls battered by life but still standing, still refusing to break. And somewhere beyond those sterile white walls, their little miracle fought to stay with them. The hospital waiting room hummed with a quiet that felt almost sacrilegious. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. A vending machine rattled out an occasional hum. Somewhere behind double doors, life and death wrestled in whispered urgency. Jake paced the floor, the cheap linoleum squeaking under his worn boots. Every few minutes, his eyes darted toward the nurse's station, willing someone, anyone, to come through those doors with news. Sophie sat slumped in a stiff plastic chair, her arms wrapped around her middle like she was trying to hold herself together. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, but her jaw was set in grim determination. Jake wished he could do more. He wished he could fight whatever infection had seized little Hope, wrestle it away with his bare hands. Instead, all he could do was wait and pray. The minutes stretched, then an hour, maybe two. Time didn't move normally here. It warped and bent, stretching thin with fear. Finally, the swinging doors opened. A young nurse appeared, her scrubs patterned with tiny cartoon bears that felt absurdly out of place in this moment. She looked tired but kind. "Family of Hope Dawson?" she called gently. Jake and Sophie shot to their feet so fast the chairs clattered behind them. "She's stable," the nurse said, offering a small smile. "The fever's coming down. She's a tough little one." Sophie let out a sob that shook her whole body. Jake caught her before she collapsed, holding her upright as she wept into his chest. The nurse approached, lowering her voice. "We're admitting her overnight for observation. We'll keep her hydrated and monitor her breathing. You can come see her soon. I'll let the doctor know you're here." Sophie nodded against Jake's chest, unable to speak. Jake just squeezed her tighter, murmuring soft words that neither of them would remember later. Hope was going to be okay. That was all that mattered. After they settled Hope into a small, sterile hospital crib surrounded by monitors and IV lines, Jake slipped outside for a breath of air. The storm had eased somewhat, but heavy snow still blanketed the town in drifts taller than most pickup trucks. The world looked strangely pure under the silver light of the street lamps. Clean, silent, forgiving. Jake leaned against a metal railing, exhaling a long plume of breath into the freezing night. He thought about the envelope Sophie had thrown away, about the choices they had made. Hard choices, the kind that left scars. And he wondered briefly if it had been foolish to think they could do this alone. His hands were shoved deep in his pockets when he heard a familiar voice behind him. "There you are, you stubborn fool." Jake turned. It was Edna Clark, bundled into a massive parka that made her look like a determined snowdrift. Beside her stood Tom Green, his farmer's cap dusted with snow, and behind them, more townsfolk, a half-dozen familiar faces from the garage, the diner, the grocery store. People Jake had known for years but never really leaned on. Until now. What are you doing here?" Jake asked, stunned. Edna harumphed. You think you're the only one with ears in this town? She said. News travels faster than gossip in a knitting circle. Tom clapped a heavy hand on Jake's shoulder. Hospital called the volunteer fire department for backup in case they lost power, he said. We figured, while we're here, we might as well help our own. Jake opened his mouth, but no words came out. Edna pushed a thermos into his hands. Hot cocoa, she said gruffly. You look like you could use it. Jake stared at the crowd, overwhelmed. There were bags of supplies at their feet, diapers, baby clothes, food. Someone had even brought a handmade quilt. We ain't rich, Tom said, scratching his chin, but we got hearts and hands, and that counts for something. Jake felt his throat close up. He blinked hard against the sting in his eyes, not trusting himself to speak. Edna nudged him. Take it, Dawson. Let us be part of something good for once. Jake finally found his voice rough and thick. Thank you, he said. I don't even know what to say. You say yes, Edna said firmly. You say thank you, and then you pay it forward someday. Jake nodded, swallowing hard. I will, he promised. Inside the hospital, Sophie stood at the window, holding Hope in her arms. She watched the little group gathered outside, their breath fogging in the cold, their arms full of supplies, their faces lit with stubborn, homely kindness. Tears spilled down her cheeks, but for once they weren't tears of fear or grief. They were tears of hope. Real, stubborn, undeniable hope. Hope born not from miracles or grand gestures, but from something stronger. Community. Connection. The quiet, fierce love of a small town that refused to let its own fall. Later, as Jake sat beside Hope's crib, watching the steady rise and fall of her tiny chest, he felt Sophie's hand slip into his. He looked up. She smiled at him, soft, tired, but radiant. I think we found our family, she whispered. Jake squeezed her hand. No, he said quietly. I think we built it. Outside, the storm howled against the windows, but inside they were unbreakable. Together. Always together. The storm passed, but the cold lingered. Jake stood in the garage doorway, surveying the town under its heavy quilt of snow. The sunlight, weak and watery, glinted off rooftops and blanketed fields, casting a soft, almost dreamlike glow over the battered little town. Hope was home again, sleeping soundly in a second-hand crib tucked in the warmest corner of the garage office, her tiny chest rising and falling in peaceful rhythm. Sophie was humming as she folded a fresh load of baby clothes donated by half the town. There was a lightness to her now, a subtle uncoiling of tension that Jake hadn't realized he'd been watching for. It felt like they'd fought through the worst of it. It felt like, maybe, just maybe, they were winning. And that's when the black sedan returned. Jake saw it first, pulling up slow and deliberate, leaving twin tracks through the slushy street. His body tensed immediately, every instinct firing in warning. Langston. He didn't need to see the driver to know. Sophie saw the car too. She froze, a freshly folded blanket slipping from her hands. Jake stepped in front of her without thinking. The door creaked open and Langston emerged, dressed in another immaculate overcoat, the same polished shoes, the same mask of cold civility stretched across his face. He carried a briefcase this time. Jake stepped outside to meet him, letting the door swing shut behind him. The air between them crackled with tension. Langston surveyed Jake with something between disdain and faint amusement. I see the town rallied around you, he said. Charming. Jake said nothing. He didn't know this man conversation. Langston opened the briefcase with a practiced snap and pulled out a thick folder. He held it up between two gloved fingers. I'm prepared to make a new offer, he said. One significantly more generous. Enough to change your lives, yours, hers, and the child's. Jake didn't move. Langston continued, voice smooth as glass. A house, a trust fund, full medical care, all contingent, of course, on her surrendering custody. Quietly, no lawsuits, no public scene. A clean break. Jake's fists clenched at his sides. Langston took a step closer, his smile tight and controlled. Think about it, he said. You're a mechanic barely scraping by. Do you really think you can offer that child the life she deserves? Jake's mouth tasted like iron. For one dizzying second, he thought about it. A real house. Warmth. Safety. Security for Sophie and Hope. A chance to build a life without scrimping and struggling for every dollar. But then he thought about the nights Sophie had spent curled around Hope, whispering lullabies into the dark. He thought about the way Hope's tiny hand would find Sophie's finger in her sleep, anchoring herself to the one person she trusted most in the world. He thought about the kind of man who believed love could be bought and sold like a used car. Jake shook his head slowly. "You don't get it," he said, voice steady. "You can throw money at the problem all day long, but you can't buy what's real. You can't buy loyalty, or sacrifice, or love." Langston's mouth tightened into a thin, hard line. Jake took a step closer, feeling the truth of it pulse through him with every heartbeat. "Sophie doesn't want your blood money," he said. "She doesn't want your fancy houses or your contracts. She wants her daughter. That's it. That's all she's ever wanted." Langston's eyes narrowed. "You're making a mistake," he said coldly. Jake smiled without humor. "No," he said. "You made the mistake when you thought she could be bought." For a moment the two men stared at each other, the snow swirling around them, the only sound the faint rattle of wind against the metal siding. Then Langston snapped the folder shut, his movements sharp and angry. "You'll regret this," he said. Jake watched him climb into the sedan, watched the tires spin slightly on the ice before catching and pulling away down the street. He stood there long after the car disappeared, letting the cold bite into him, grounding him. He had made his choice, and he would stand by it no matter the cost. Inside the garage, Sophie waited, her hands wringing the hem of her sweater. When Jake stepped back in, she didn't ask what had been said. She didn't have to. Instead, she crossed the room and threw her arms around him, holding on tight. Jake hugged her back, breathing in the scent of snow and baby powder, and something else. Something new and fragile and fiercely precious. Hope stirred in her crib, a soft sigh slipping from her lips. Jake and Sophie stood there in the center of the cluttered old garage, surrounded by broken engines and battered tools, and the unmistakable, undeniable weight of their decision. They had chosen love, chosen family, chosen each other. And though the road ahead would be hard and the future uncertain, one thing was clear. Their hearts could not and would not be bought. Spring crept into town like a shy child, hesitant then all at once. The snowbanks shrank, exposing muddy sidewalks and the first brave shoots of green. The mountains in the distance still wore their white crowns, but the air had softened, carrying with it the sharp scent of thawing earth and distant rain. At Hope's garage, change wasn't just in the weather. It was everywhere Jake turned. The battered garage that had once been little more than a place to survive was transforming into something more, something alive. It started small, an idea tossed around between oil changes and diaper changes, a tiny corner set aside with a coffee pot and a few folding chairs. Sophie's idea, naturally. She'd suggested it one afternoon when a couple of farmers lingered after paying, swapping stories over lukewarm coffee Jake brewed in an ancient pot. "People like having a place to rest," she'd said with a shy smile. "Maybe we could make it official." Jake had grunted non-committally at first. He wasn't in the business of running a cafe. But then Edna showed up with a box of homemade muffins, and Tom dragged in an old table from his barn, and suddenly it wasn't just a garage anymore. It was a gathering place. Hope's garage became a strange and wonderful hybrid, half auto shop, half community center. Farmers sipped coffee while waiting for their tires to be patched. Retired folks stopped by just to sit and swap stories. Kids rode their bikes past after school, waving through the open bay doors. And always at the heart of it all was Sophie, with Hope strapped against her chest or toddling nearby on uncertain legs, greeting each visitor with a smile that lit up the dusty old building like sunshine. Jake had even hung a new sign above the door, hand-painted by one of the local teens, "Hope's Garage, where second chances begin." It made people smile when they saw it. It made Jake smile too, even when no one was looking. One bright Saturday morning, Jake stood outside the garage, hammering the last nail into a hand-built bench. The smell of fresh lumber and spring filled the air. Sophie stepped out, balancing Hope on one hip. The baby, now chubby and curious, babbled happily, reaching out to grab a fistful of Jake's flannel shirt. Jake laughed, catching her tiny hand in his calloused one. "You supervising again, little one?" he asked. Hope squealed in response. Sophie smiled at the scene, brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "You know," she said, settling beside him on the bench, "if someone had told me 6 months ago I'd end up here, I would have laughed in their face." Jake leaned back, surveying the transformed garage. The new coffee corner, the flower boxes Edna insisted on planting, the battered jukebox Tom had dragged in and somehow coaxed back to life. "Yeah," he said. "Me too." They sat there for a moment, hope nestled between them, watching the town slowly come to life around them. Cars passed by, horns honked, neighbors waved. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't polished, but it was home. Later that afternoon, a small crowd gathered for the official opening of Hope's garage. It wasn't anything fancy, just some folding chairs, a lot of laughter, and more food than anyone could eat. Jake found himself standing awkwardly at the edge of the gathering, feeling a little out of place in his grease-stained jeans and worn boots. Edna bustled over, a plate of cookies in one hand. "Go on," she said, nudging him forward. "This is your moment too, you know." Jake shook his head, smiling wryly. "I'm not much for speeches." "Doesn't have to be fancy," Edna said. "Just speak from here." She tapped his chest, right over his heart. Jake watched as Sophie knelt by Hope, adjusting her tiny flowered dress, laughing softly at something the baby did. Something in Jake's chest tightened and loosened all at once. Maybe Edna was right. Maybe it was time. He stepped up onto the little platform Tom had rigged out of old pallets. The crowd quieted, turning toward him with expectant faces. Jake cleared his throat, feeling the heat rise to his cheeks. Well, he began, awkward as ever. "This isn't exactly the speech I had planned, mostly because I didn't plan one." A ripple of chuckles ran through the crowd. Jake smiled, loosening a little. "I guess I just want to say thank you," he said, "to all of you, for not giving up on people, for believing in second chances." He glanced down at Sophie and Hope, standing side by side, both looking up at him with trust and pride shining in their eyes. "And for teaching me," he said, voice roughening, "that sometimes the best things in life aren't the ones you plan for. They're the ones that find you when you least expect it." A soft murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Jake took a breath, steadying himself. "This place isn't much," he said, gesturing around. "It's a garage, a coffee pot, a few old chairs." He smiled. "But it's also hope. It's family. And it's proof that even when the road gets rough, you can still find your way home." The crowd erupted into cheers and applause. Jake stepped down, feeling more humbled than he could ever remember. Sophie met him halfway, Hope giggling between them. She slipped her hand into his without hesitation, and together they faced the future. The wide, uncertain, beautiful future, shoulder to shoulder. Hope's garage wasn't just a building, it was a promise, a second chance, and maybe, just maybe, the beginning of something even more extraordinary. The celebration wound down as the sun dipped behind the mountains, painting the sky in strokes of gold, violet, and deepening blue. One by one, the neighbors drifted away, waving and calling out promises to return soon for more coffee and stories. Tom clapped Jake on the back hard enough to nearly knock the wind out of him. Edna pressed a jar of homemade strawberry preserves into Sophie's hands with a wink and a gruff, "You've earned it, sweetheart." Soon, it was just the three of them again. Jake, Sophie, and Hope, standing in the cooling air outside the garage. The new sign overhead creaked gently in the evening breeze. Jake inhaled deeply, letting the coolness fill his lungs. For the first time in longer than he could remember, the world felt right. Hope squirmed in Sophie's arms, rubbing her sleepy eyes with a tiny fist. "I'll get her settled," Sophie said, smiling up at Jake. "I'll clean up out here," he replied. She disappeared inside, her shadow moving against the warm lamplight, and Jake busied himself gathering up folding chairs and empty plates. The tasks were mindless, soothing. By the time he finished, the stars had begun to scatter across the velvet sky, sharp and clear in the crisp spring air. Jake stood for a moment, staring upward, letting the vastness settle around him. It was humbling, this sky. It made his problems seem smaller, his fears more manageable. Behind him, the door creaked open. He turned to find Sophie stepping out onto the porch, a blanket draped over her shoulders. Hope, already asleep, lay tucked in her crib inside. Jake offered a small smile. Quiet now, he said. Sophie nodded, her face soft in the starlight. For a moment, neither spoke. They simply stood there side by side, drinking in the silence. Then Sophie drew in a shaky breath. I never said thank you, she said quietly. Jake frowned, glancing at her. You don't have to. I do, she interrupted, her voice trembling slightly. You saved us. Me and Hope. You didn't have to, but you did. Jake looked away, embarrassed. I didn't save anyone, he said. You were the one fighting the whole time. I just gave you a place to catch your breath. Sophie laughed softly, the sound like music in the stillness. You gave us a home, she said. That's not nothing. Jake stuffed his hands into his pockets, feeling suddenly awkward, like a teenager fumbling for words. Sophie turned to face him fully now, the blanket slipping slightly to reveal the curve of her shoulder. I was scared when I got here, she said. Scared I'd made the wrong choice. Scared I wasn't strong enough. Jake met her gaze, steady and sure. You're one of the strongest people I've ever met, he said simply. The words seemed to hang between them, suspended in the cool night air. Sophie stepped closer, so close that Jake could see the faint freckles across her nose, the way her eyes reflected the starlight. I'm not scared anymore, she whispered. Jake's heart hammered against his ribs. He wanted to reach for her, to pull her into his arms and promise that she would never have to be scared again. But he held himself still, giving her the space to choose. Slowly, deliberately, Sophie closed the distance between them. She rose onto her toes, her hands finding the worn edges of his jacket. Jake bent his head instinctively, his breath catching. Their lips met, soft and tentative at first, like a question. Jake answered without hesitation. The kiss deepened, full of everything they hadn't dared say. Gratitude, relief, hope, something more powerful and terrifying than either had expected. When they finally pulled apart, Sophie rested her forehead against Jake's chest, laughing softly, almost giddily. I think, she murmured, I've been falling in love with you for a while now. Jake closed his eyes, savoring the words like a prayer. He tipped her chin up gently, looking into her shining eyes. I know, he said, his voice rough with emotion, because I've been falling for you too. Sophie smiled, a real, radiant smile that lit up the night better than any star. Jake wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close. Above them, the universe spun in its silent dance, uncaring and infinite. But down here in this tiny corner of the world, two broken hearts had found each other, and somehow, impossibly, they were whole, together. The first light of summer spilled over the mountains, washing the town in shades of gold and soft rose. From the top of the small hill just beyond Main Street, you could see everything. The worn shingles of the town library, the weathered steeple of the little white church, the familiar red and white sign of Hope's Garage. Jake stood there, his hands in his pockets, feeling the warmth seep into his bones after a long, stubborn winter. Beside him, Sophie held Hope, now a giggling, sturdy toddler, who stretched her arms toward the sky as if she could catch the sunlight itself. Jake glanced sideways, watching as Sophie turned in a slow circle, laughing as Hope squealed in delight. It was a sound he could listen to forever. He hadn't planned to come up here this morning, but something had pulled him, the same something that had whispered to him months ago when he first heard a girl crying outside his garage. Cold and alone. Fate. Luck. Providence. Or maybe just hope. He liked that explanation best. Down in town, preparations for the 4th of July fair were already underway. Streamers fluttered between lampposts. Tables were set up along the sidewalks. Children ran laughing from booth to booth, trailing ribbons behind them. Hope's Garage would be front and center today, a booth offering free coffee and homemade cookies, courtesy of Edna and half the town's grandmothers. Jake had protested at first, but Sophie and the others had insisted. This place isn't just about cars anymore, Sophie had said, smiling that smile that always unraveled his doubts. It's about second chances, about belonging. Jake hadn't argued after that. Sophie settled Hope onto the soft grass, letting her explore the field of tiny wildflowers that nodded in the morning breeze. Jake watched them, heart full and aching at once. He hadn't known it was possible to love this deeply, to feel this tethered, this alive. He knelt beside Hope, who immediately thrust a crumpled dandelion into his hand with a triumphant shout. Jake laughed, ruffling her soft brown hair. "Thank you, little lady," he said solemnly, tucking the flower behind his ear to Hope's absolute delight. Sophie sank down beside him, her shoulder brushing his. For a long moment, they simply sat there, three hearts beating quietly in rhythm with the morning. Sophie broke the silence first, her voice low and certain. "I was lost before I found you," she said. Jake turned to her, the rising sun catching the glint of moisture in her eyes. "You saved me," she said, her voice thick. "Not just with a roof or food or a warm place to sleep. You saved me by seeing me, by believing in me." Jake swallowed hard, his chest too tight for words. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket, his fingers closing around the small velvet box that had weighed heavily there all morning. When he opened it, Sophie gasped softly. Inside, a simple gold ring gleamed, catching the newborn light. Jake's voice when he spoke was steady but rough with emotion. "I didn't plan any of this," he said. "I didn't plan on a crying girl showing up at my garage. Didn't plan on a baby making me believe in miracles again." He took her hand, the one that had trembled that first night and grown stronger with every choice she'd made since. "I didn't plan on falling in love," he said. "But I did, hard and fast and forever." Tears slid down Sophie's cheeks unchecked, but her smile was radiant. Jake looked into her eyes, the eyes that had weathered storms and still found the courage to shine, and asked the only question that mattered. "Marry me, Sophie. Build this life with me. Build this family." Hope clapped her hands together, babbling joyfully at the excitement in the air. Sophie laughed through her tears, nodding so hard Jake thought she might tip over. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Yes, Jake. 1,000 times yes." Jake slipped the ring onto her finger, his hand surprisingly steady. Around them, the morning deepened into full day, the town stirring into celebration. But for Jake, Sophie, and Hope, the world had narrowed to this perfect, breathtaking moment. They sat together in the tall grass, tangled in each other, the town bustling below them, the sun rising above. And for the first time in a very long time, Jake Dawson knew, deep in his soul, that he was exactly where he was meant to be. Not because he had built an empire, not because he had won some grand victory, but because he had chosen love over fear, kindness over pride, hope over despair. And those choices, small, stubborn, everyday miracles, had built a life stronger and sweeter than anything he could have planned. At the bottom of the hill, the new sign over the garage caught the light and gleamed like a promise. Hope's Garage, where second chances begin. And on that golden morning, it was clear to anyone who cared to look. Second chances weren't just possible. They were already blooming, right here, right now, forever. We'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments below. It's always heartwarming to see how stories like this connect us across the miles. If you enjoyed this story and would like to hear more heartwarming tales about love, kindness, and second chances, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Your support truly helps us continue creating stories that inspire and uplift. Thank you so much for spending your time with us today. Wishing you warmth, hope, and beautiful moments wherever you are.